Well, you may have noticed that I am all alone up here today. If you're a member of our fellowship or have otherwise been here long enough to know how we usually do Sunday services, you may have noticed some things missing this morning. If this is your first time here today, welcome, and I'm really glad you're here, and I apologize for everybody else's confusion, but all will soon become clear, I promise. So what is missing or different today? Well, for one, the lay leader, that's me, doesn't usually have this much responsibility on Sunday mornings. Also, we usually sing out of hymn books. We would have lit a chalice by now, and in fact, there'd be other flaming chalice symbols scattered about the place. Even the order of service is missing a few words, such as calling this congregation the Fellowship of the Peninsula. Let's imagine that then. Imagine this as some non-denominational congregation. A fellowship of the peninsula, all alone in the world, without any wider faith tradition of which it is a part. Imagine, in other words, that there is no Unitarian Universalist association. How would a congregation like ours make do without the benefits and resources derived from being part of that wider faith tradition? Well, let's consider just one of those benefits and resources. Consider this hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition. It's published by the Unitarian Universalist Association, and it's the result of 5 years' worth of work by the UUA's Hymn Book Resource Commission. Who knew? We're used to singing hymns out of it every Sunday, maybe even a reading or two, but without the UUA creating the commission, subsidizing the work, and paying for the copyright licenses and so forth, there would be no hymnal. What would we use instead? This is a question worth asking. Maybe the New Century hymnal from the United Church of Christ, but perhaps only the hymns that are particularly liberal, even for that liberal denomination. Maybe we'd be able to find more songs like Weave, songs that are appropriately spiritual but not religious. Though without the Unitarian Universalist Association, there would be far fewer of those sorts of songs too. Thankfully, the UUA does exist and does publish hymn books. So let's bring in our copies of Singing the Living Tradition now and hand them out. I would ask the web team ushers to please help us out with that. Now then, that does feel a little bit better, doesn't it? Let's see what else is missing. Well, there's the chalice, but we'll get to that in a moment. Before that, though, let's talk about who might be missing. A very important function of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to evaluate and certify new ministers. And a big part of preparing ministers to be ministers, of course, is the training. There's the academic work which takes place in a seminary. There are two of those associated with the UUA, namely Star King in San Francisco and Meadville Lombard in Chicago. And then there's the practical work of becoming a minister. That usually takes place at hospitals and at teaching congregations. We've been fortunate enough to have been a teaching congregation these past 2 years. So now it's high time to bring in our student minister, Christina Hochman. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Chris graduated from Meadville Lombard 1 week ago. Congratulations to Chris. And she had come to us from her home congregation in Richmond. But if there were no Unitarian Universalist Association, we'd have no connection with Meadville to have one of their students here, and we'd have no connection with Richmond to have one of their members here. So, thank goodness the UUA does exist.
Yes, if it weren't for the Unitarian Universalist Association, I wouldn't have been your student minister for the past 2 years, and I wouldn't now have a Master of Divinity degree from Meadville Lombard Theological School, and I would not have been evaluated and certified ready for ministry. And maybe my life would have been simpler over the past 3 years. But my life would also be less full and rich, given the wonderful people and the many experiences that have helped me become the minister I am today. As I'll describe next Sunday, it's made a world of difference for me to be part of this wonderful and warm and loving congregation. And as most of you know, another major event for me this month was being called to serve the Unitarian Universalist Church of Corpus Christi in Texas. What you may not know is that in addition to the schooling and all the training and all the certifying, the UUA plays a vital role in the ministerial search process as well. After all, most congregations don't go directly to the ministers they want and offer them a job. And there's no magic to finding a minister who seems like a good match to any given congregation. And of course, professional headhunters cost more than almost any congregation can afford. So the Unitarian Universalist Association helps out, making the search process a lot easier for both the congregations and the ministers to find one another. There's actually a website that the UUA provides where both sides upload a lot of information about themselves, about who they are and what they are seeking. It's kind of like Match.com or eHarmony for congregations and ministers. And thanks to the UUA, the ministers in search can identify congregations that seem like they'd be a good place to serve. And then congregations can look at the ministers interested in them and decide which one they think is a good fit. It's thanks to the UUA, in other words, that I'm going to Corpus Christi. And since this congregation went through its own search process 7 years ago, it's thanks to the UUA that y'all have a minister too. Whoa, here he is. There's something else that's a feature of every Sunday morning that we owe to the Unitarian Universalist Association, and that is our flaming chalice. It began as a symbol of hope and liberation when it was created during World War II in support of the work of the Unitarian Service Committee. And the flame was actually used as a signal to help refugees escape from Nazi Europe. A few decades later, the UUA adopted it as a symbol for its own documents, and as such, congregations started using it too. We usually have the flaming chalice on display here in this sanctuary, on the wall in the framed piece of the old pulpit, and on the front of this pulpit. And of course, most obviously missing right now is our physical chalice, in which we light an actual flame. And this chalice was actually given to us by a former youth named Keith Dixon many, many decades ago. And this chalice actually survived the fire that burned down one of our original buildings. Bring it in. Now that we have both hymn books and the chalice, I would ask you to join me in speaking aloud together in unison, reading number 443, while Scott lights our chalice. That is reading number 443, We Arrive Out of Many Singular Rooms by Kenneth Patton.
We arrive out of many singular rooms, seeking the assurances of friendship, community, presence, and human contact. This is the reason of cities, of homes, of assemblies in the houses of worship. It's the reason of congregations and also of denominations, in our case, an association of congregations. And given the presence of hymn books and the chalice, given that Chris and I are present too, we are also aware of the presence of that association here in our own singular room of this sanctuary. In some of the things we do, we draw attention to how they connect us with other Unitarian Universalist congregations. Last Sunday, we celebrated the Flower Communion, as did other UU congregations that same day. And almost all UU congregations hold a Flower Communion service sometime in the spring. And in the fall, we and almost all other UU congregations hold a Water Communion service. Now, for all that they seem timeless, it's important to remember that these traditions had a beginning. We know that Maya Chapek brought the Flower Communion to this country during World War II, sharing it with some congregations who then shared it with others. If it weren't for those congregations being part of an association with one another, there wouldn't be a Flower Communion. It's less clear how the Water Communion started. I once heard that it began at a conference, perhaps a UU women's retreat, and the participants then took it back to their home congregations, who then shared it with other congregations. Once again, if it weren't for the association of those congregations, there wouldn't be a Water Communion. And that brings me to the last thing that we need to uncover, the last thing that we need to reclaim as part of recognizing that our association of congregations, the Unitarian Universalist Association, does indeed exist, and that's our joys and sorrows table. Now, it's also not clear how joys and sorrows began, and it may even have been created in more than one place, given the number of different ways of doing it. But what is clear is that this congregation did not create it. We practice joys and sorrows here every Sunday at first service, less often at second service, because we heard about it thanks to being part of a wider association of congregations. And of course, part of how we do joys and sorrows is sing Spirit of Life, number 123 in the hymn book. Carolyn McDade wrote her sung prayer for reasons that had little to do with Unitarian Universalism, but it wouldn't be as known and loved by so many UUs if it weren't for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And so, in this community of compassion and gratitude, let us now take time to share with one another what is in our hearts, our joys, our sorrows, and important milestones that are truly changing our lives. I invite you to receive and light a candle, then tell us your name, and briefly share what matters to you so much that you can't not share it. You may choose to light a candle in silence, but if you do speak, please use the microphone so that everyone here this morning may hear your words. Thank goodness the Unitarian Universalist Association does exist. Without the UUA, we wouldn't have hymn books full of inspiring words and music. Without the UUA, we wouldn't have the flaming chalice, either as a symbol or as a physical object. Without the UUA, we wouldn't have beloved, meaningful rituals like Flower Communion and Joys and Sorrows. And without the UUA, Chris wouldn't have been here as our intern, and I wouldn't be here as your minister. Of course, there are many more benefits and resources we receive from being part of a wider association. Elsewhere on our campus this morning, for instance, at second service, children and youth will be engaged in religious exploration. 3 of the RE curricula we've been using all this year, namely Sing to the Power for elementary school-aged children, Building Bridges for middle schoolers, and A Place of Wholeness for high schoolers, all of them come from Tapestry of Faith, a curriculum series produced by the UUA that congregations, or anybody for that matter, can download and use completely free of charge. And next year, we'll be offering Our Whole Lives, the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum for teenagers, which is a joint project of the Unitarian Universalist Association and the United Church of Christ. And if you're a member, hands up please, if you're a member. Thank you. If you're a member, you should have received this magazine in the mail just this week. UU World is published each quarter by the UUA and sent out to all members of congregations, and there's always lots of fabulous content in it. This issue did make me laugh, though. The cover story is about the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Central Oregon and their rapid growth in recent years. And as I scanned through it, I recognized a face in the pictures. So I looked more closely. It turns out that their first minister, hired in 2004, was Jean Pupke, who is now my colleague at First UU in Richmond. Then their first called minister, a couple of years later, was Heather Starr, who is now one of the co-ministers of my home congregation in Hartford, Connecticut. Then Central Oregon had an interim minister, Alex Holt, who I've met at Southeast UU Ministers Association meetings when he was in our region. And for the last couple of years, their minister has been Antonia Won, whose face I recognized in the article's pictures because she was student minister in Albuquerque immediately before I did my internship there. Now, I want to note that this isn't about me, though my life has been enriched in many different ways for knowing these colleagues. And it would be easy to say, as if everything was explained, well, it's a small UU world. But the fact is, I wouldn't know these wonderful people. I wouldn't be working alongside them if it weren't for the Unitarian Universalist Association. After all, we tend to think of the Unitarian Universalist Association as a separate institution in its own right, doing its thing up in Boston. And we've already seen how, as an institution, it provides so much that we need as a congregation. But that's an outcome, an end result of what it means to be a congregation in covenant with other congregations, to be an association of congregations. So take a hymn book, please, and open it to hymn number 1. We're not going to sing it, that's just a handy reference point. Then turn back one page. On the left, you'll see a page of text that begins with the big word, we. Well, you could argue that the big word we says it all, but maybe it needs some unpacking. So please read with me the top 3 lines on that page in capital letters there. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. Thank you. Then what follows are the 7 principles and the 6 sources, all 13 of which, of course, only exist because the UUA exists. And then at the bottom of the page are another 3 and a bit lines of text, so please read those with me too. Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. Thank you. That's the covenant that this congregation makes with all other Unitarian Universalist congregations. The promise we have made to be part of a wider association with a pledge of mutual trust and support. It's what makes us not just some non-denominational fellowship of the peninsula, but rather the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the peninsula. Just as members of this congregation covenant with one another to form the congregation, promising to support it with time, talent, and treasure, so do member congregations of the UUA covenant with one another to form the association, promising to support it with the congregation's time, talent, and treasure. It's a promise we make as the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Peninsula, a promise that's also made by those congregations in Central Oregon, Richmond, Hartford, and Albuquerque, a covenant that holds us in relationship with them and with more than 1,000 other UU congregations. A pledge of mutual trust and support. It should be pretty obvious why we make that promise. We can't do it all by ourselves. Not even big congregations like First UU in Richmond can do it all by themselves. Consider the fact that we're sending 2 of our own emerging leaders, Catherine Oziot and Rosalie Pfister, to leadership school this summer. It's not cheap to send 2 people for a week-long immersive residential program like that, so a big thank you to the trustees for agreeing to pay about half of the cost from endowment income. But it would cost even more if it weren't being subsidized by the UUA. Or consider that over the last 20 years, this congregation has benefited from 2 Chalice Lighter grants, money that's collected directly from participating members of other congregations in our region. The most recent grant was about $25,000 to pay for the renovation of our office building when we bought it 6 years ago. Or consider that thanks to the association, we have a voice on national, even global issues. Earlier this month, for instance, UUA President Peter Morales addressed LGBTQ clergy and other leaders in the United Methodist Church, recognizing their bravery and offering them encouragement as their denomination struggles to be fully inclusive and welcoming. None of these are things that we would be able to do by ourselves. And recognizing that, we can be proud that this congregation has a long history of doing its part to support the Unitarian Universalist Association. Up until a couple of years ago, we were what is called a fair share congregation, meaning that we gave to the UUA an expected amount of money from our budget each year. I'll note as an aside that this used to be calculated as a certain amount per member, but now it's simply a percentage of the budget. The new method of figuring fair share, known as GIFT, that's G-I-F-T, is actually more fair, particularly since some congregations now admit that they used to play games with their membership rolls to try to reduce what they would pay. Please know that this congregation did not play such games. In any case, the amount of our fair share didn't change much from the old method to the new, and going back 25 years, quite possibly more, we had been a fair share congregation. We can, as I say, be proud of that. Unfortunately, that changed a couple of years ago. Given our budget the year before last, we only contributed to the UUA about 1/3 of our fair share. And in this year's budget, as UUFP Treasurer Alan Sheeler pointed out last Sunday, there's actually no money for the UUA at all. So we want to try to fix that today. If, as Scott said earlier, you'll remember or have otherwise been here long enough to know how we usually do services, you may have noticed that we haven't collected the offering yet. And as we usually say in introducing the offering, all that this fellowship is and all that this congregation has are what we bring to it. Our time, our talents, our capabilities and concerns, and our money. Well, the same is true of our association. All that the UUA is and has are what we and other congregations give to it. So today we're going to share our offering with the UUA. Now, I'm not deluding myself that a single Sunday's offering would allow us to pay our full fair share to the UUA. That would be truly fantastic in the original sense of that word. But I do see this as a first step back to making good on the promise we make as a congregation, the covenant that we have entered in association with our sister congregations. And now, in gratitude for the resources and services that come to us from the UUA, in recognition of the benefits and advantages that follow from being part of a wider association, and in keeping our promise of mutual trust and support to our sister congregations, let us now collect the offering, and as is our tradition, receive it with the singing of hymn number 402, From You I Receive. Thank you not only for your support of our shared mission and ministry as a congregation, but also for being a congregation that strives to do its part to support the wider association to which we belong. There is one more task before us as a congregation today, and that is to thank and congratulate Christina Hochman. 2 years ago, we welcomed Chris to this congregation as our student minister, and since then have seen her stretch and grow and become not just a student, but a minister. During that time, she has successfully navigated a number of challenges, completing her MDiv program at the Meadville Lombard Theological School, interviewing with the UUA's Ministerial Fellowship Committee, and being approved for preliminary fellowship, going through the search process, including a grueling schedule of visiting congregations in different parts of the country, all 4 weekends in February, and at the beginning of this month, candidating at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Corpus Christi, which voted unanimously to call her as minister. As if that weren't enough, we've kept Chris busy here too. She has planned services and preached sermons. She has taught RE classes and facilitated forum discussions. She has offered pastoral care and has participated in committee meetings and board meetings, and even proposed a way to make board meetings run more efficiently and take less time. Thank you. And in conjunction with her program at Meadville, she has begun to forge a relationship between this fellowship and the Boys and Girls Club that is practically next door. Chris, your time with us has been a blessing. We know that this internship was an essential part of your formation as a minister, but frankly, I think we may have gotten the better end of the deal. You really could have gone anywhere, and any congregation would have been glad to have you as their student minister. And so we shall count ourselves fortunate that you chose to spend these 2 years with us. Please come up here so we can recognize you. Our thanks this morning also go to the members of the Internship Committee, which has played an important role in guiding Chris through this process, meeting with her each month and evaluating her progress. Thank you, Nikki, Tara, Jim, Pat, and Brittany, if you would come up to the pulpit as well.